I was racing against top level triathletes on their time trial bikes, and although they got a small head start, I fought my way through the field for the next 180 kilometers to try and chase them down. At one point on the hillier section of the course, I laid down 376 watts of normalized power for 9 minutes to try and bridge the gap. But did I make it? Welcome back to the channel, everybody. In this video we have part 1 of a 2-part weekender of events. This event, 180 kilometers, and in the next video, the following event the next day, 215 kilometers. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that video too. I know 2 events in one weekend sounds a bit crazy, but I am training and preparing for a double header event in Switzerland. The UCI gravel event and the UCI Gran Fondo, both of which are incredibly hilly, and I'm very excited to test myself over 2 days of Swiss alpine climbs. So this event that I did was part of Long Course Wales, which is like a multi-day format. 3 days, 3 disciplines: swim, bike, run. The idea is, of course, you could do all 3, but you can also just enter the individual events if you so wish. The bike event is actually called the Wales Sportive, which is what I entered. And there are a couple of route choices, but I went for the full 112 miles or 180 kilometers. It takes in many of the roads that are used in the Ironman Wales course, which is also known as potentially the hilliest Ironman course in the UK. The last 50 miles, 80 kilometers, are incredibly lumpy, so it really suits me down to the ground. There's a total of about 2,200 meters of elevation gain over the course of the whole route, but most of that comes in the latter half. Now, for me, there was really 2 reasons why I was here. 1, to raise money for the Swansea Health Board, and 2, to test myself and get some practice in, both from a performance standpoint and nutrition standpoint and pacing standpoint, for the upcoming trip to Switzerland. So a quick bike check then, and there were a couple of modifications that I made to the bike in the run up to this. I actually took my Continental GP 5000 TT tyres off of my climbing wheel set and put them on a set of 40-60 mil, slightly deeper section, slightly faster, for this sort of terrain. Didn't set them up tubeless this time. Instead, I had some TPU tubes in them, so rolling resistance slightly changed. So I added a couple of extra things to the bike as well. So on my seat post, I actually managed to secure my pump just under my saddlebag, so it saved me carrying it in my skin suit, which is what I was actually wearing for the whole ride. It sounds a bit bizarre, but I remember years ago when Mark Cavendish and a couple of other riders first started using skin suits in road races before they started putting pockets on them and then calling them like road racing skin suits effectively. So I had to get a bit creative with how I was carrying things. You also noticed that on my stem I had my own personalized like notes. So any sort of sharp descents, any sort of tough climbs, any headwinds, crosswinds, which there were a couple of areas that I had to be wary of. All of these things you can craft yourself just by using a slip of paper, sellotaping it, and just writing down the little things that you need to know. And you can rotate it around your stem so it's constantly in front of you in the correct position.
Now it's going for your back.
Filming?
Yes.
I feel a bit silly, but all in the name of speed.
You look a bit silly.
I know.
You look like you've got some kind of
Tube.
yeah.
Like I've just rolled out of hospital.
Right, come on then. You got to get down there.
Right,
Got to get a good position. Yeah.
So into the event then, and it's kind of unique in a sense that you have people on time trial bikes or road bikes with clip-ons and people on just standalone road bikes. And like I said, it's kind of almost like 2 events in one. The first wave of riders were, the leading triathletes from the swim the night before. Then you had a couple of riders who had made it to the front row, if you will, in the starting pen, and they got let off as well. And what I didn't realise was that then they were going to hold back the majority they were just going to let through a few people at the start. And they held us there for, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes. And I had actually climbed the barrier to get into a relatively good position close to the front. I saw a couple of people I knew, and I got there and I was like, right, so now the front's gone and I'm gonna have to chase them. Initially, I was frustrated, but as soon as we rolled out, I realized there was a good reason for that, because it was quite narrow and very busy, lots of barriers in that first couple of kilometers. So I suppose it was important not to just let everybody go at once. You know, there's a good few thousand people there. So very sensible. But needless to say, the front few, and they were being followed by a TV motorbike that was live streaming to YouTube. Unfortunately, I couldn't get to it. Now, although you couldn't see me in the live coverage in the first few kilometers, there is a clip later I'll show you of me blasting up a climb later on in the event. So for the first 15 minutes, my normalized power was very close to 300 watts. I set off in pursuit and quickly realized that on my own, although I was catching groups steadily, at one point there was a very big long stretch of road and I couldn't see anybody in front. So I realized that this wasn't going to be sustainable. You know, if I was going to do this event in 5 hours, give or take, I can't exactly ride the whole thing at 300 watts. So instead, I used my noggin and I backed off. A group came from behind and I sat in with them, and it was a good group. There was a triathlete there, there was a couple of other riders there who I think were doing the shorter route, the half distance. Ideally, they would be going harder, knowing that it's a shorter route they have to do. So I sat with them for a bit and monitored my nutrition and pacing up until that point. Now the lanes were quite tricky. They were narrow in places. There was parts of concrete roads because some of the area we were in is military. So there's cracks in the road. And I heard about incidents where people had got their wheels, or tires rather, caught in these cracks and fallen off. Now that's like a nightmare situation. You know, you can't control your bike when that front wheel goes down into that crack. So I hope anybody that crashed, not just because of those types of roads, but I witnessed a few going into a corner far too quickly and sadly came off. I hope everyone has a speedy recovery. So those doing it on time trial bikes or with clip-ons technically couldn't draft. They had to just ride either to the right of a group or lay off the back of a group or go to the front of the group. And road bikes could draft. Now this was, I think, policed very loosely. I think if you were seen to be doing it on, you know, live coverage, then it's a different story. But if you were doing it in the countryside in the middle of nowhere, I don't know how they would police it or how they would stop it. Personally, in the group I was in, I didn't see it happening, which was good. But of course, imagine having 4, 5, 6 triathletes on full time trial setups, full triathlon, high speed equipment setups and drafting each other. You can imagine how high the speed could be in that situation. So the first 2 hours, it settled down. My normalized power got to around about 250 watts. So very similar in a way to Mont Ventoux a couple of weeks ago. And this gave me plenty of time to fuel and prepare for what was to come. And the speed up until now had been really quite solid, sitting around 35 kilometers per hour for the first 3 hours. Now, a word on nutrition, because this was a little bit different. Because unlike Mont Ventoux, where it was a little bit shorter, it was also less intense in a way, because most of the event was fairly mundane until actual Mont Ventoux at the end. And this ride, I had in my head that I was going to do a Pogačar inspired attack, regardless of where I was in the groups, on the road, what position I was in. I was going to try and really stretch myself by going with around 75 kilometers to go in the event, which would actually be on a climb called Wiseman's Bridge. It's just before Saundersfoot, and then it's just before the actual finish or the start of the second loop that you do. So my actual idea was to attack and try and sustain like a max effort for the final 2 hours or so to the finish. So nutrition, I cannot emphasize enough, plays a massive role in your performance, especially in the latter part of an event, because unsurprisingly, power that you produce on the bike is greatly influenced by the amount of work you can do. essentially that is what power is, right? It's energy production, output. So in order to achieve that, you need to eat and fuel appropriately. So for this effort, I realized that I'm gonna need as much as I can potentially carry. I don't want to stop. So I had two 750ml bottles on my bike, both of which had 120 grams of carbohydrates in them. Now, that's extremely concentrated. So to balance that out, I had a bladder of water on my back, which was approximately 800 mils of plain water. Now, to give you a very basic explanation, I would drink half of that 750ml bottle in the first hour, or per hour, and then I would take a couple of gulps from the bladder to sort of dilute the solution a little bit that I was drinking. And then I was also having a 150-gram gel per hour. So you're looking at around 110 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So then, Wiseman's Bridge, this climb with approximately 75-80 kilometers to go, was where I decided to make a bid for freedom. I was in a group that I'd caught probably about 20 or 30 kilometers prior. There's a very long uphill section, gradually goes uphill over the best part of 20 kilometers. And there's lots of little climbs that go up, but you're always going up. There's never a point where you feel like you're actually going downhill. There are some descents, but never actually very long. So at this point, the leaders in my mind are well up the road, and apparently 20 minutes at this point. So catching them would be a tall ask, but that won't stop me from having a good performance to end the day. So I approached Wiseman's Bridge and I was clinical. I set off up the climb at 400 watts for about 2 to 2.5 minutes. You have a very short recovery on the descent, and then up through Saundersfoot and out of town. So for this whole 9-minute section, I normalized very close to 380 watts. The initial 45 minutes, including this attack and following it, I normalized 320 watts, which is around about 93% of my FTP. Now, in this time period also came my peak 50-kilometer speed from the whole event. And I feel like it's appropriate to mention that because this is essentially an event where people are trying to go faster. You know, doesn't matter if you're at the very front or you're a pro, or if you're at the very back and you're returning and you're trying to beat your time from last year. I think it's very appropriate to talk about this because even though it's the hilliest section, I still went faster because of how I fueled, how I saved energy, and then how I paced that final 50 to 70 kilometers as well. So 38.5 kilometers per hour was my average over this 50 kilometer segment. 304 watts normalized. And I'd say one of the biggest things that I noticed as I was going around that last loop, that last 50 kilometers or so, and I was going past riders and catching riders and saying hello to familiar faces, the familiar kits, the people that I knew, cheering them on and giving them encouragement. One thing I noticed, the ability to keep pushing over the top of a climb or a rise and into a descent. In my opinion, you only ever really recover when your speed starts to go, you know, well above your current average speed. For me at the time, obviously that was quite fast, 37 kilometers per hour. So it wasn't until I was really getting onto a descent that I would freewheel and give myself that chance to recover. Now, that can translate to, you know, if your average speed is 25 kilometers per hour, you know, press over the climb until you know you're actually going at a considerably higher speed. Then you can recover. Yes, it shortens your recovery time. I know that. That's the downside. But the upside is you do gain a considerable amount of time, I feel. And that section really highlighted that, I think. So I mentioned earlier that I was about 20 minutes behind the leaders at one point on that really long, draggy section with about 30 kilometers, 20 kilometers to go. I actually managed to catch two of the triathletes that were, I think, in the front 10 or front 8 at one point. And I went past them, and it was only then that I realized that I could be within a shout of being placing quite high. I never really knew where I was on the course and what position I was in. But I never stopped chasing. I kept getting after it because I knew that you don't know what's going to happen in the last 20 or 30 kilometers if someone is on their last legs. So that final 2 hours, I normalized 312 watts and averaged a smidge under 37 kilometers per hour. Now those 2 climbs I mentioned, Wiseman's Bridge and Saundersfoot, they come one after the other and they come in the last sort of 10-15 kilometers of the event. I went 40 seconds slower over that segment, over the 2 climbs, this time round. But the damage had already been done to the time gap and to myself. So I finished a spent man. But I managed to chip away approximately 8 minutes, according to Strava, roughly, over the last 50 miles, 45 miles, 80 kilometers. And I was actually very, very pleased with that. Initially crossing the line, I was gutted. I knew that I'd finished in just under 5 hours, which I was very chuffed with, but I was just a little bit gutted that I couldn't make the bridge at any point during the event to be with, you know, the really fast people at the front. And it was just a day of chasing, and mentally, when you're on the back foot, it just takes a lot out of you to try and maintain concentration and to try and keep plugging away when you know that you might not ever see the front of the event again. But in the end, I finished first road bike. I think I finished 4th senior, 5th overall. And because of the effort of the last 80 kilometers, I managed to whittle the gap down to, I think it was between 12 and 15 minutes to the eventual triathlon winner. So all in all, it was a good day. A massive ride, in fact, with a total of 5 hours of riding, 35.9 kilometers per hour, 282 watts normalized, 4,370 kilojoules, 325 TSS. But that's not where it ends, because tomorrow and the next video we have the 215 kilometer drag and ride Gran Fondo Epic, which I try to beat the time of 6.5 hours on. Yes, after that ride. So I'll see you for that video. Well done to everyone who participated. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.